The day Canada stopped playing nice. Asterisk, asterisk. You're watching this for one reason. Because on January 30th, 2026, something happened that most American media barely mentioned, but it may permanently change North America's auto industry. That morning, 1,200 Canadian auto workers walked out of a General Motors plant in Oshawa, Ontario for the last time. No farewell speeches, no long warnings, just layoffs. Jobs gone, futures shaken. But while cameras focused on workers leaving the factory in the freezing cold, something far more important was happening miles away in Ottawa. Canada's industry minister stood in front of reporters and said 4 words that stunned executives across Detroit and Washington. We want our money back. Not a request, not a negotiation, a demand. She wasn't talking about pocket change. She was talking about hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that Canada had given to General Motors under one simple condition: keep Canadians working. GM took the money. Then GM cut the jobs anyway. And just like that, Canada's long-standing role as America's quiet, obedient manufacturing partner began to collapse. This wasn't a strike. This wasn't a protest. This was Canada saying, enough. Because the truth is, this story didn't start in January 2026. It started decades ago, with a deal Canada now deeply regrets. For years, Canada accepted a fragile bargain. We would be the low-cost, reliable factory floor for American corporations. In return, they would provide jobs, stability, and access to the massive U.S. market. For a while it worked. The 1965 Auto Pact created a deeply integrated auto industry. Parts flowed freely across the border. Ontario became the beating heart of Canadian manufacturing. Cities like Oshawa and Windsor weren't just towns. They were livelihoods. Entire families built multi-generation careers on the assembly line. But here's the part nobody likes to admit. Dependency is not partnership. And when conditions change, the dependent side has no leverage. By the mid-2010s, the warning signs were already there. American automakers were slowly pulling back, quietly shifting investments south. Canada stayed patient. Canada stayed polite. Then came Donald Trump. Tariffs, threats, trade wars. Suddenly, loyalty disappeared overnight. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers don't lie. In 2016, America's Detroit 3 built more than half of all vehicles made in Canada. By 2025, that number collapsed to just 23%. That's not a decline. That's abandonment. Auto assembly jobs dropped sharply, and then General Motors made its move. In May 2025, GM announced it would eliminate the third shift at its Oshawa plant. The excuse? Market conditions and trade uncertainty. Translation: Trump scared us, and Canada is expendable. The third shift alone employed hundreds of workers, but the real damage spread far beyond the factory walls. Suppliers, truck drivers, inspectors, technicians. By the time the dust settled, up to 1,200 jobs were wiped out. Workers were told layoffs might be avoided if trade talks succeeded. They never did. On January 30th, 2026, people who had given decades of their lives to GM walked out with nothing but shock and fear. And here's where the story turns ugly. That same week, General Motors reported over $12 billion in profits. Not losses, profits. Instead of protecting Canadian workers, GM announced massive stock buybacks and bigger payouts to shareholders. Canadian jobs were sacrificed so Wall Street could smile. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Should companies that take public money be allowed to walk away with no consequences? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what comes next affects far more than GM. Corporate betrayal meets political reality. Asterisk, asterisk. If the Oshawa layoffs were painful, what came next was infuriating. While Canadian workers were being sent home, General Motors was ramping up production in the United States. Same truck, same model, different side of the border. The Chevrolet Silverado was still being built, just not in Canada anymore. Instead, GM quietly added workers at its Indiana facility. Canadian jobs didn't vanish, they were moved. This wasn't about demand. It was about politics. Appease Washington. Avoid tariffs. Protect profits. Canadian workers paid the price. Then came another blow. In late 2025, GM shut down production of electric delivery vans at its Ingersoll plant, once promoted as Canada's EV future. Over 1,200 workers were left in limbo. Now here's the detail that should make every taxpayer furious. Canada had already paid for those plants. In 2022, federal and provincial governments handed GM over $500 million in funding. That money was tied to job guarantees. GM accepted it, then broke the promise. Normally, governments swallow losses like this. They call it the cost of doing business. But this time, Ottawa didn't blink. On the very day workers were laid off, the industry minister went public. Canada would be clawing back the money. This shocked corporate Canada. Subsidy clawbacks are rare, politically risky, legally messy. But Ottawa crossed a line and meant it. The message was clear. If you take Canadian money and abandon Canadian workers, you will pay. And then something even more dangerous happened for Detroit. Canada began naming names. While GM was cutting jobs, other automakers were staying loyal. Japanese manufacturers kept investing, kept producing, kept employing Canadians. This wasn't emotional, it was strategic. And it forced a question nobody in Washington wanted to answer. Why were foreign companies more committed to Canadian workers than American ones? The answer lies in corporate culture. American automakers live quarter to quarter. Profits today matter more than strategy tomorrow. Japanese firms think in decades. Their Canadian plants aren't disposable cost centers, they're long-term assets. And while GM ran, Japanese manufacturers doubled down. By 2025, they accounted for nearly 80% of all vehicles built in Canada. This wasn't luck, it was patience paying off. Before we move on, think about this. If loyalty exists in business, should governments reward it or just hope it continues? Because Canada has made its choice. Canada's quiet pivot away from America, asterisk, asterisk. Here's the part most people missed. Canada's response to GM wasn't emotional revenge. It was carefully planned. Months before the layoffs, Ottawa was already preparing a pivot. Quietly, strategically. High-level meetings in Asia. Private talks with global manufacturers. Long-term planning. Canada wasn't just punishing GM, it was building replacements. Asian automakers were looking to reduce reliance on China. They needed stable partners, skilled workers, secure resources. Canada checked every box, and Ottawa made something very clear. Investment is welcome, but betrayal has consequences. A new framework was rolled out. Subsidies would now come with real enforcement, long-term production commitments, Canadian content requirements, workforce training guarantees, annual compliance audits. Break the deal and the money comes back with interest. This wasn't protectionism, it was accountability. At the same time, Canada refined its trade retaliation strategy, not loud tariffs. Targeted pressure. Products from politically sensitive U.S. states were hit first. Now automotive parts are next. American plants rely heavily on Canadian components. Ottawa knows this, and Ottawa is prepared to use it. This isn't a trade war, it's economic leverage. And then comes the final piece. Critical minerals. Lithium. Nickel. Cobalt. Canada controls resources the EV future depends on, and access is no longer automatic. If companies want Canadian minerals, they must invest inside Canada. Build here, hire here, commit here. This is the new rulebook, and companies around the world are paying attention. The end of the branch plant era, asterisk, asterisk. The layoffs in Oshawa were real, painful, life-changing, but they marked something bigger. They marked the moment Canada stopped accepting broken promises. For decades, Canada played the polite partner, took the hits, absorbed the losses. That era is over. Now there are expectations. Take public money, honor public commitments, respect workers or lose access. This isn't anti-American, it's pro-Canada, and every corporation watching this unfold is recalculating. General Motors saved money by moving jobs south, but it lost something far more valuable. Trust, access, influence. History may remember January 30th, 2026 as just another layoff date. But for Canada, it was the day the branch plant economy began to die, and something stronger took its place. Final CTA/payoff. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and share this story, because economic sovereignty isn't built in silence. It's built by calling out betrayal and rewarding those who stand by their commitments. Welcome to the new Canada,